There exists a grief no one warns you about. Not the grief of losing someone beloved, though that carries its own blade, but the grief of a body that has not received the news. Milk arriving warm and insistent for a mouth that will never open. A grief without ritual, without mourning clothes, without neighbors at the door speaking in hushed tones. The world does not grieve children it never knew. It simply continues. And you stand still while everything streams past like water around a stone. Eliza Fernsby knew this grief the way bone knows cold. She had carried her son 9 months. She had felt him turn in the darkness, those slow, submerged movements that belong to no other bond, that exist only in the private country between a woman and the life taking shape inside her. She had laid her hand against the swell of herself and believed, with the reckless, burning certainty of a woman who has nothing else left to hold, that he would rescue her. That he would make the abandonment coherent. That he would answer every question she had been too proud to speak aloud. Was I worth staying for? Was any of it true? Does it matter, finally, that I was here at all? She believed he would be hers completely, without condition, in a world that had already stripped everything else away. He lived 11 minutes. She counted each one. Afterward, she lay in the narrow bed of the room she rented above the butcher shop in Ashwick, and she listened to her own body with something close to horror, because her body did not know. Her body carried on with its ancient, indifferent labor, milk arriving on the second day like a tide that obeys no sorrow, only biology and the clock. She pressed her hands against herself in the dark and felt the warmth. Something inside her broke in a way she had no words for. Not her heart. Deeper. The part of her that had believed, without proof against all evidence, that the universe was watching. 300 miles distant, in a manor house that smelled of beeswax and inherited wealth and fresh morning, a different loss was seeping into the stone. The Duke of Windermere had a son. The Duke of Windermere no longer had a wife. And the child, small, furious, impossibly alive, screamed through the night in a house filled with servants who had no answer for him. Attended by a man whose hands would not stop trembling, Dorian Graves, 7th Duke of Windermere, had led men through battle. He had brokered treaties that redrew borders. He had buried his father at 19 and stepped beneath a title so crushing it took 2 years before he could stand upright under it. He was not, by any fair measure, a man who came undone. Yet every time he looked at his son, this small, red, catastrophically living creature who had cost his wife her life and seemed utterly ignorant of the debt, Dorian felt something that was not quite grief, not quite love, something far less readable than either. Something lodged in his chest like a bird trapped in a chimney, panicked, without direction, making it nearly impossible to draw breath. 2 people, 2 losses, and between them, a child who was starving. This is the story of what happened when they found each other. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. For those who have been here before, thank you. You already know what lives in these stories, so settle in. Close your eyes if you like, and let me tell you about Eliza Fernsby and the Duke who did not yet know he needed her. The letter from Mrs. Holt arrived on a Thursday. Eliza nearly left it unopened. She had been sitting in the same chair for 6 days, not from weakness, but because movement felt like a betrayal of something she could not name. Each time she rose, the house reminded her she was alone in it. The rooms were small and stubbornly ordinary. They had no patience for grief. The kettle still required filling. The fire still required laying. The world carried on with a blunt, almost offensive practicality, and Eliza had nothing left to match it. Each time she passed the cradle, borrowed from a neighbor, lined by her own hand with flannel she'd spent 3 months saving for, she had to look away so fast it made her head swim. She hadn't moved it. She couldn't explain why. It felt essential to leave it where it stood, as though shifting it would declare something she was not yet prepared to declare. But the letter lay on the table, and Mrs. Holt had shown her kindness when no other soul had bothered. The midwife had gripped her hand through 8 hours of labor, had murmured to her in the darkest stretch of night, had been the one to tell her, gently, with a steadiness Eliza had seized like a lifeline, what had happened. So she opened it. The midwife's handwriting was blunt and efficient, underscore underscore quote underscore zero underscore underscore. Eliza read it twice. Then her gaze drifted to the cradle. She considered what it would mean to go, to take this body still producing milk for a child who would never drink it, and offer it to a stranger's son instead, whether that was betrayal or mercy. She sat with the question a long time. In the end, she decided she could not afford the distinction. She was 24 years old. She had no husband, no money, no reputation worth defending in any county where her name was known. She had a body still faithfully performing the duties of motherhood for a child who was gone. And somewhere beneath the grief, she had a terrible stubbornness. Not the kind born of strength, but the kind born of refusing to let everything that has happened to you be the last word spoken. She stood. She began to pack. The journey to Windermere Manor consumed most of a day aboard a mail coach that reeked of damp wool and cracked leather, filled with the particular weariness of people traveling toward places they'd rather avoid. Eliza sat beside the window and watched England slide past her. The flat fields of Somerset yielded to rolling green country beyond, and she tried not to think about what she was doing. She did not entirely succeed. Her mind turned to the last time she had traveled somewhere carrying hope, 2 years ago, following a man who had made promises with the easy confidence of someone never once required to keep one. She had believed them because she had wanted to, and she had paid for that wanting in the currency women always pay, quietly, privately, with no one watching and no one to tell. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and reminded herself, this was different. This was practical. This was survival. Not hope. She was very precise about that distinction. The manor was grander than any building Eliza had ever entered through the front door, which she did not. She came through the servants' entrance, naturally, and was shown to a small but clean room by a housekeeper called Mrs. Garrett, who wore the expression of a woman who had weathered a great deal and fully expected to weather more. "The Duke will see you in the morning," Mrs. Garrett said, already moving down the corridor. "For now, the child is in the east nursery. Second floor, third door. He has been crying for 2 hours." Eliza did not ask for directions. She followed the sound. The nursery was lit by a single lamp. In the corner, in a chair far too rigid for its purpose, sat a man clutching a screaming infant with the focused desperation of someone diffusing an explosive. She assessed him quickly, the way she had learned to assess rooms, looking for what mattered, what was wrong, what needed doing first. He was younger than she had expected, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed as though the day had begun with intent and lost it somewhere around noon. His cravat hung loose, his jaw was clenched in the precise manner of a man refusing to let a situation become worse than it already is, an expression she recognized at once. The look of someone holding themselves together by sheer force of will and beginning to run out. His eyes, when he lifted them to her, carried that precise shade of gray found only in English skies moments before the weather breaks. And they were exhausted, not tired, exhausted in the bone, in the deep places where sleep offers no repair. This was the Duke of Windermere. He looked like a man who had been holding everything together with both hands for 3 weeks straight, slowly realizing it was not enough. "You are Mrs. Halt's person," he said. His voice came low, measured, the voice of a man who had discovered that if he kept his tone level, the rest of him might hold. "Eliza Fernsby." "Yes, he won't eat." "I can see that," she said, and extended her arms. He hesitated. She watched the hesitation travel across his features, the calculation of propriety, of safety, of what protocols govern placing your infant son into the arms of a woman you had known for roughly 45 seconds. She understood. She did not have time for it. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "he is hungry. Everything else can wait." Something in him settled. He crossed the room and placed his son into her arms with a tenderness that was almost difficult to witness, the exquisite carefulness of a man terrified of doing harm. Henry Ashford, heir to the Windermere dukedom, was small and red and furious. He weighed almost nothing. He smelled of milk gone slightly wrong, of clean linen, of the particular desperation belonging to a small body that had been asking for something and not receiving it for too long. Eliza drew him against her chest, and for one terrible moment she felt it. the specific gravity of an infant held close, the way her body remembered and answered before her mind could intervene, the treacherous warmth. She did not think about her own son. She locked that door. She did not open it. She thought only of this child, this particular child who was hungry and frightened and had earned neither. The crying did not stop all at once. It faded the way a storm passes, from full fury to hiccups to the small, tentative sounds of a body beginning to trust. His whole frame softened against her, degree by degree, like a fist slowly unclenching. Eliza exhaled. She did not look at the Duke. The Duke did not look away from her. "How did you do that?" he said. Not quite a question. More the observation of a man witnessing something outside his framework. "I didn't do anything. Your Grace, he was ready. He just needed someone to be ready too." She said it plainly, the way she said most things. She was not by nature a woman who rounded her words to ease their landing. Life had never rewarded her for softness. But she watched something shift in his face, a small, involuntary thing, there and gone, and she filed it away without examination. She sat in the chair by the window. Henry fed. The Duke remained standing in the far corner of the room. Eliza carefully, precisely, did not look at him. But she was aware of him, the way one is aware of a candle flame in a dark room, never looking directly, yet knowing always exactly where it burns. She was aware of the quality of his stillness, not relaxed, arrested, as though something had caught him mid-motion and he had not yet decided how to continue. She was aware that he stayed far longer than propriety required. And she was aware, when she finally heard him leave, the soft, deliberate closing of the door, the footsteps retreating down the corridor, that the room felt different without him in it. She told herself it was simply the absence of another adult, the sudden quiet. She was not entirely convinced. A routine established itself, the way routines do, not by design, but by the simple tyranny of a child who demanded feeding at the same hours each day and cared nothing for social convention. Eliza rose before dawn. Henry woke at 5, dependable as a church bell and twice as loud. She would hear him from her room down the hall. The first sounds not quite crying, more like declarations, as though he were informing the household of his requirements in advance of escalation. She would be halfway to the nursery before she was fully awake, moving on instinct, her body already knowing what was needed before her mind arrived. She did not expect to encounter the Duke in the corridor at 5 o'clock in the morning. She met the Duke in the corridor at 5 in the morning, every day for a week, always fully dressed. That was the first thing she registered, and it disturbed her in some quiet, nameless way, because it meant one of two things, and neither was uncomplicated. Either he had not slept at all, or he had risen in the black hours before dawn and dressed with the same rigid formality he carried through every waking moment, as though sorrow did not grant him even the mercy of a loosened collar. She suspected, watching him in those gray corridor mornings, that it was both. The first morning they simply looked at one another, said nothing. She went into the nursery. He followed, stood in the corner, watched. She offered no explanation. He requested none. When Henry was settled, Dorian left without ceremony. The way a man exits a room he is not certain he was permitted to enter. The second morning he was already there when she arrived, standing over the crib, not touching, simply looking at his son with an expression so carefully held together that it revealed everything about what lay beneath. She had learned, in her years of watching people perform courage for each other, that the most composed faces always concealed the most turbulent interiors. She did not announce herself. She crossed to the chair and sat. After a moment, he stepped back. The room held them both without demanding anything from either. The third morning, she found him holding Henry, not with the panicked grip of their first encounter, but tentatively, one hand beneath the head, one beneath the back, his vast frame curled over this impossibly small creature, with the labored, deliberate care of a man teaching himself something he did not know how to ask another person to show him. Henry was awake, regarding his father with the profound, unfocused gravity of a newborn studying the universe. Eliza stood in the doorway. She watched the Duke's face as his son made a small sound, not crying, something else, something exploratory. And she saw the thing that moved across Dorian's expression in that moment. unguarded, unnameable, entirely private. She took a quiet step back into the corridor. She waited a full minute before entering again, loudly enough that he would hear her approach. It seemed the decent thing. Neither of them spoke of it. But a door had opened somewhere in the architecture of those early mornings, and neither of them shut it. It was the library that undid her first. She had asked Mrs. Garrett in her second week whether there was anywhere in the house she might find something to read. Her days stretched long. Henry slept through the afternoons, and she had not thought to bring books. She had left Ashwick in something close to a fugue state, packing only what was practical, leaving behind the small shelf of volumes she had gathered over years with the careful, deliberate pleasure of someone who cannot afford many things, but has decided that books are non-negotiable. Mrs. Garrett had looked at her with mild surprise, the particular surprise of a woman recalibrating a category, then told her the library was on the second floor, east wing, and the Duke would not mind. The library was the most beautiful room Eliza had ever entered. Floor to ceiling, four walls, every inch claimed, a ladder on a rail worn smooth at the grip by decades of hands. Light pouring through tall windows facing the garden, falling across the spines in long gold bars. The smell of paper and time and something faintly like cedar, like a room that has been loved for a very long time by people who understood how to love things quietly. She stood in the doorway a full minute before trusting herself to step inside. She felt obscurely that she did not deserve it. That rooms like this were built for people with histories she lacked. That entering without some permission she had not been granted would expose her as an imposter. Then she thought, Mrs. Garrett said, and she went in. She was standing on the ladder, her finger trailing along the spines of a row of natural philosophy texts. Buffon, Linnaeus, a battered copy of Gilbert White's Natural History she had wanted to read for 3 years and never managed to afford, when she heard the door open. Eliza Fernsby, said the Duke. She nearly fell off the ladder. She did not fall. She possessed more pride than to let it show, but her hands tightened on the rail, and when she turned, he stood in the doorway, shirt sleeves, an expression that carried, she was nearly certain, the ghost of amusement. So faint it might have been invention. She decided it was not. Your Grace, I was told, Mrs. Garrett said. She was correct, he replied, already crossing toward the desk at the room's center. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 14, underscore, underscore, underscore. He sat, opened a ledger, took up a pen as if she were not present, as if it were perfectly ordinary for the Duke of Windermere to share his library with the woman nursing his son, as if the entire concept of ordinary had been quietly pensioned off and replaced with something more practical. Eliza retrieved the Gilbert White, descended, settled into the chair beside the window. Neither spoke for an hour. It was the most at ease she had felt since arriving at Windermere Manor. More than that, it was the most at ease she had felt in longer than memory could accurately reach. Something lived in the texture of that shared silence. The specific comfort of two people performing nothing for one another. It settled into her chest like warmth from a banked fire. She had not understood until that afternoon how much energy she had spent these past 2 years on performance. Performing fine, performing capable, performing unbothered, performing the precise degree of dignity a woman in her position must perform to be regarded as a person. None of that was required here. In this library, in this chair, beside this man absorbed in his ledger, asking nothing. She could simply be a woman reading a book about birds. The pleasure of it was almost too much to bear. He spoke at last without raising his eyes. Quote 15, he said. A statement, not a question. He must have noticed when she climbed down. Quote 16, she said. Quote 17. A pause, the scratch of his pen against paper. He said, she looked at the shelves and considered what it would mean. The slow gathering of afternoons in this room, in this chair, borrowing this man's books. She thought about how much she wanted it, and how unwise the wanting was. Thank you, she said. He nodded, still without looking up. And that was all. But she noticed when she left that evening a bookmark resting on the corner of his desk, a strip of burgundy ribbon placed precisely where she would see it. Without comment, without ceremony, she picked it up. She used it. She said nothing about it the next morning in the corridor at 5 o'clock. Neither did he, but she was aware of it, the small, quiet weight of it, the way one is aware of a hand extended in darkness. Later, much later, when she would try to identify the moment things shifted, she would return to those early library afternoons. Not because anything happened, because nothing did. Because for an hour at a time, in a room lined with books, two people who were both grieving sat near each other and performed nothing at all. She would come to understand that this was the thing she had been starving for without knowing its name. Not touch, not words, simply the permission to exist in a room without apologizing for it. That, she would realize, was rarer than she had ever known. It was Lord Percal Ashford who said it aloud first. He arrived in the fourth week, younger than his brother by 6 years, lighter in every conceivable way. He carried the easy confidence of a man who has never once been required to be the serious one. He came through the front door as though it belonged to him, which technically it did not, and immediately set about rearranging the atmosphere of the house in the cheerful, oblivious manner of someone who has never considered that an atmosphere might prefer to remain undisturbed. Eliza observed him at dinner. She ate with the upper staff. But Pearl discovered this arrangement within roughly 40 minutes of his arrival and pronounced it an abomination. And so she found herself at the family table, while Dorian regarded his brother with the expression of a man who had long since accepted defeat in certain battles. Said Pearl, settling into his chair with vast satisfaction. Pearl pointed at her. Said Dorian, in the tone of a man who has wielded that single word as a full sentence since boyhood. Quote 26 Pearl went on, pouring wine for everyone, Eliza included, without invitation. Quote 27 the Duke studied his wine glass. Eliza studied her plate. Lord Pearl glanced between them with the serene expression of a man watching something unfold in careful slow motion and possessing the good sense not to disturb it. She was turning Pearl's words over later that night, what it meant to be different, the particular peril of being noticed, when she heard it. She was walking back from a late feeding, drifting through the dark corridor, and a sound halted her. It came from behind the shut door of Dorian's study. Not weeping, nothing so readable as that. A sound like something tightly controlled pressing against its own seams. The sound of a person who has held something close for far too long and has finally, in the small hours when no one watches, begun to lose his hold. She stood in the hallway. She told herself all the sensible things. She was the wet nurse. She had no standing here. His grief was not her concern, and her compassion was nothing he had requested. The world she inhabited held very precise ideas about what women in her position were owed and what they were allowed. None of those ideas included knocking on a duke's door in the dead of night because she had heard something in a corridor. She stood in that hallway a long time. Then she knocked. Silence. Then I don't require anything. His voice, level. Perfectly measured, designed to close the exchange without admitting it had opened. I know, she said through the wood. I wasn't offering anything. A longer silence. Not empty. Occupied. A person on the far side of a door arriving at a decision. The door opened. He had been sitting at the window. She could tell by the chair, angled wrong, pulled too near the glass. Outside, the grounds lay dark. The garden she had grown to love by daylight was invisible now. Only blackness, and the occasional form of a tree against a marginally lighter sky. There was a portrait on the far wall. A woman, fair-haired, rendered with the slightly rigid formality of an official likeness. Not cold, precisely, but formal in the manner all such portraits carried, as though the painter had been instructed to capture the title rather than the soul. Dorian stood in the doorway. He had shed his coat, his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and his hair was disordered in a way she had never witnessed before. The evidence of hands dragged through it in frustration or anguish. The private proof of feelings he refused to make public. He looked, she thought, like a structure that had borne weight for a very long time and was growing slowly conscious of where the fractures ran. You don't have to be all right. You know, Eliza said. Something crossed his face, a swift succession of things, there and gone like light shifting over water. I beg your pardon. Everyone in this house treats you as though grief is something to be endured quickly and quietly so we can all return to normal, she said. She was not being cruel, she was simply stating what was true, because she had learned that true things went unspoken too long, and the silence surrounding them grew teeth. I just thought someone should say it. You don't have to be all right. Not tonight. Not in this room. He stared at her. She was distantly aware this was possibly the most inappropriate thing she had ever uttered to anyone, let alone a duke, let alone her employer. She did not retract it. He was quiet a long while. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Still careful, but a different species of careful. The carefulness of a man choosing precision over protection. She and I were not. It was not a love match. We were well suited. We respected each other. I believe she was content. But I did not. I tried to be a good husband. I'm not certain I knew how to be anything beyond a correct one. And now I cannot. I cannot understand why I feel as though I've lost something I'm not certain I ever possessed. You lost what it might have been, Eliza said. Her voice barely carried. What you hoped it could become, even if you never spoke it aloud, even if you hardly confessed it to yourself. That is its own kind of mourning, Your Grace. It has no name, so people don't think to honor it. But it is real, and it belongs to you, and you owe no one an apology for carrying it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had opened in a way she had never witnessed before. Not vulnerable, precisely. Something more exact than that. The expression of a man who has been fumbling through a language for years and has just, for the first time, heard it spoken fluently. And yours? He asked. She did not pretend to misunderstand. Mine has a name. It simply doesn't have a remedy. I'm sorry, he said, plain, without theater. I know, she said. So am I. She left him there in the study with the black window and the formal portrait. But something had turned quietly, without ceremony, the way a tide shifts and no one marks the precise second. Neither of them was the same person walking away from that exchange as they had been walking toward it. She thought about that, lying in her narrow bed in the small room at the end of the east corridor, listening to the house settle its bones around her. She thought about how strange it was that grief could serve as a bridge if you allowed it. That two people bearing different weights could recognize the shape of each other's burden across every barrier the world had raised between them, and feel briefly, dangerously, less alone. She told herself to be careful. She fell asleep already failing at it. Lady Constance arrived on a Tuesday with 2 trunks and the particular energy of a woman who has decided she is the answer to a problem and is merely waiting for the rest of the world to agree. She was beautiful, Lady Constance. Eliza acknowledged this with the honest detachment she had cultivated over years of being the woman in the room who was not the loveliest woman in the room. Fair, composed, dressed with the restraint of someone who has never needed effort. She carried the effortless authority of a woman who had never once entered a room and questioned whether she belonged there. She had loved the late Duchess like a sister. She wore her grief elegantly and with genuine feeling, a combination Eliza found herself respecting even as she recognized the danger in it. Lady Constance was not performing sorrow. She was truly grieving. She simply also believed that grief and pragmatism could coexist, and that the pragmatic solution to the Duke's situation was and had always been self-evident. She noticed Eliza on the 3rd day. The wet nurse, she said, materializing in the corridor with the easy possession of someone who considers every space her natural territory. Yes, Mrs. Garrett mentioned. How long do you intend to stay, Eliza Fernsby? As long as Henry needs me, my lady. Children outgrow wet nurses quite rapidly, you know. Lady Constance's smile was kind in the way a closed door is kind. No malice lives in it. It is simply shut. Quote, 48 __. Eliza smiled. The way women learn to smile when someone has said something that warrants an entirely different response. Quote, 49 __. Lady Constance studied her for a moment with the appraising gaze of a woman excellent at reading situations. Then she nodded once and continued down the corridor. Eliza remained where she stood for a breath afterward. She was not frightened of Lady Constance, precisely, but she recognized what she represented. A reminder of everything that stood between Eliza Fernsby and the life she was beginning, foolishly and without permission, to imagine. She found Dorian in the library that evening. She had not intended to. She went there because it was the one room in the house that felt like breathing, and he was already there, standing at the window with a glass of brandy and the slightly hollowed expression of a man who had been gracious for 7 hours running and was nearing the edge of his capacity. He turned when she entered. She faltered, conscious all at once of Lady Constance, of what her presence implied, of the shape this moment was taking around her without her permission. She said, quieter still. She lowered herself back into the chair. He remained at the window. Beyond the glass, rain had begun, that soft, relentless English rain carrying no intention of stopping, only of continuing without apology or end. Quote 53, he said at last. Quote 54. He turned the glass between his fingers. Quote 55. A silence. Quote 56, he said quietly. Eliza looked at her hands. She was acutely aware of the distance between them. 12 feet, perhaps 15, and equally aware it was insufficient. Not because she wished it smaller, because she was becoming, despite every deliberate effort against it, conscious of him in ways that had nothing to do with employment. She noticed when exhaustion sat behind his eyes. She noticed when he made an effort that cost him something invisible. She noticed the particular quality of his attention when he entered a room, steady, unhurried, like a man who had learned to observe closely because he once spent years observing the wrong things entirely. She was aware of the noticing. She was aware it constituted a problem. She was choosing with great precision to do nothing about it. Quote 57, she said carefully. Quote 58, she looked up. Quote 59, he said. Quote 60, something in his voice, not command, nothing resembling command, a request. The kind that understands it asks for more than its surface permits. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, 2 seconds longer than wisdom allowed. Quote 61, she said. Quote 62. He agreed. He did not withdraw it. Quote 63, she stopped. Started again. Quote 64. He set the brandy glass down. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new kind of care, not shielding himself, trying not to frighten her. Rain struck the windows, he said. A long silence. The rain, the lamp, the 12 feet between them that felt like nothing and everything at once. Quote 68, she said. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, the way a person closes their eyes around something they wish to keep. Quote 69, he said. She did not say, "You're welcome." She picked up her book. She read 3 pages without absorbing a single word. Henry Ashford learned to smile in his 7th week, not a reflex. Those had come earlier. The random, muscular twitches parents hopefully read as smiles, but which are merely a face discovering its own range. This was different. This was genuine, full and sudden and directed, aimed at a face he recognized. It arrived like weather, unexpected, transformative, altering everything it touched. He smiled first at Eliza, which she received with the specific tenderness of a woman who has learned to accept love cautiously, in case it is reclaimed. She held very still when it happened, as though any sudden motion might undo it, and she looked at him. This small, serious face suddenly illuminated from within. Something in her chest shifted that she had believed was past shifting. She was not his mother, she knew this. She reminded herself with the disciplined regularity of someone managing a chronic condition. She was his wet nurse. She was temporary. She was present because of biology and necessity and the pragmatism of grief, not because she belonged to him or he to her. She repeated this to herself, and then he smiled at her once more, and the repetition grew somewhat harder to believe. He smiled at Mrs. Garrett, who looked briefly and deeply undone before reassembling her features into their usual briskness. He smiled at Lord Pearl, who proclaimed it the finest accomplishment in 3 generations of Ashfords, and spent 20 minutes coaxing him to produce another. He smiled at the curtains, less significant, but no less wholehearted. He smiled at his father on a Wednesday morning. Eliza was there. She was always there in the mornings now. Not summoned, simply present, the way a person becomes present in a place that has begun to matter. She sat in the chair beside the window. Henry was awake, kicking his feet with the quiet pride of someone discovering that limbs answer to will. Then Dorian entered. Henry heard the footsteps. He turned his head toward the sound, that new, purposeful turning that had replaced the earlier aimless drifting, and found his father's face and smiled. The Duke of Windermere stopped mid-stride, stopped as though the ground ahead had simply ceased to exist. He stood perfectly still, looking at his son. Eliza watched something move through his expression that she had never witnessed before, something she would never quite name afterward. It was not grief. It was not happiness, precisely. It held both and exceeded either. It was the face of a man who had braced himself for weeks against the worst of everything and had just been shown by the most unqualified of messengers that he was wrong. He crossed the room slowly, bent over the crib. Henry seized his finger with both hands, the absolute certainty of a person who has decided this object is theirs and will not be surrendering it. Dorian laughed, quietly under his breath, startled entirely past himself. A real laugh, unguarded and ungoverned, the kind that is not offered but simply escapes. Eliza pressed her hand against her mouth. She turned toward the window. Outside, the garden was beginning, cautiously, to lean toward spring. She did not cry. She had established a rule about crying in the nursery, and she honored it, and it cost her greatly. The word arrived at 4 months. Henry had been producing sounds for weeks, experimental syllables of a child testing the machinery of speech, learning that his mouth could create effects upon the world. Bar and da and long open vowels launched at the ceiling with tremendous gravity, as though delivering remarks to the plasterwork. Eliza spoke to him constantly, because she had read somewhere that language grew from hearing it, and because the honest truth was that talking to Henry was the only conversation she had all day that demanded nothing from her in return. She described the plants in the garden, which she had been studying alongside the head gardener during her afternoon walks. She told him about the books she was reading. She told him, carefully, in a voice that would not travel past the two of them, about the village where she had grown up, the smell of the bakery on the high street in winter, the particular way her father's hands had looked while he read, broad and still in his lap. She told him about a man she had loved, the specific way he had spoken her name the first time, which had made her believe foolishly that the shape of it carried meaning. She told Henry things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, because he could not repeat them, and because the telling felt necessary in ways she chose not to examine. She was describing sparrows, the way they gathered in the hedge beyond her window and moved as one body, a single rippling form composed of hundreds of small ones, when it happened. She stopped talking. The room went very still. Henry looked at her. His face, for a 4-month-old, had grown remarkably readable. She had learned to interpret its shifts the way one learns to read weather. This expression was concentrated, effortful, the look of a person attempting something with great precision. He said it again. Not mama, not dada, Liza. Imperfect, approximate. 4 months old, the consonants still finding their footing, but unmistakable, aimed directly at her, spoken with the triumphant conviction of someone who has been laboring toward this moment for a very long time and is deeply satisfied to have arrived. She did not cry. She held Henry to her chest, chin resting on the crown of his head, and she breathed with deliberate precision, and she kept the rules she had made for herself. It was the most difficult keeping she had ever done, because now she understood what this was. She understood what she had become to this child, and what that knowledge meant about what she would leave behind when she left. She had known it in theory from the start. Now she knew it in the particular. Now it had a name, and the name was the shape of her own name in a 4-month-old's mouth. The most beautiful and the most terrible thing she could fathom. Dorian had been standing in the doorway. She did not know for how long. She had not heard him arrive, and she would wonder afterward how many minutes he had watched in silence. When at last she raised her eyes, he wore an expression she could not classify. something that lived between reverence and grief, and the specific terror of a man who has just grasped something that will make his next choice immeasurably harder. Dorian said, very quietly. Her voice was not entirely steady. Dorian's gaze moved to his son, then back to her. So do I. The silence that followed was impossibly full. Eliza rose. She needed suddenly to be anywhere that was not this room. I'll bring him to you after his next feeding, she said in the voice she reserved for when everything must remain practical. He's been sleeping well in the afternoons. You might try reading to him. I've found he responds to a low voice. She walked from the nursery. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself, very briefly in the privacy of that small space with the door shut, to feel the full weight of what was happening to her. The thing she had refused to name. The thing that had been growing in the spaces between library afternoons and corridor mornings and one conversation through a door at midnight. She felt it. All of it. For exactly 3 minutes. Then she stood, washed her face, and returned to work. Lady Constance found her in the garden the following afternoon. Eliza had gone outside because the house felt too full of things she could not look at directly. The nursery held Henry and the echo of that word. The library held the chair by the window and the bookmark given to her without ceremony. The corridor held the mornings. Every room in Windmere Manor had become, without her permission, laden with something she could not carry and could not set down. She had walked to the far end of the garden, where the formal hedges gave way to something wilder, a section the head gardener referred to with gentle disapproval as the old part, where the planting predated the current house and had largely decided for itself what it wished to become. She liked it there. It felt honest. Lady Constance appeared at the border of the formal hedges, as if she had been waiting for precisely the right moment. Eliza suspected she had. I'll be direct, Eliza Fernsby, she said, coming to stand beside her. I don't think you're a bad person. That's generous, my lady. I think you're a kind person in an impossible situation, and I think you are quite intelligent enough to know exactly what I'm about to say. Eliza said nothing. She kept her eyes on the old part of the garden, on a climbing rose that had found its way up an ancient stone wall and was beginning tentatively to bud. He needs a wife of his standing, Lady Constance said. Her voice was careful and not unkind. Henry needs a mother who can move through the world he will inhabit, who can go where he will go, know the people he will know, open the doors that will need opening. You have given that child something remarkable. I mean that sincerely. What you have provided in these months, the stability, the care. I won't pretend it isn't extraordinary. She paused. But what you can give him now in this house at this stage, it will begin to harm him. Not because of who you are, because of what the world is. The servants talk already. The neighborhood will begin to talk. And when Henry is old enough to understand what is being said about his father and the wet nurse, you don't need to continue, Eliza said. I know, said Lady Constance quietly. A long silence settled between them. The honest silence of two women who both understood, with perfect, unsparing clarity, the architecture of the world they inhabited. How little that architecture concerned itself with what was real, what was true, what was deserved. Eliza thought of those 3 minutes in her room, how precisely she had measured them, how completely she had failed to feel nothing. I'll speak to Mrs. Garrett, she said. I'll arrange to leave before the week is out. Lady Constance gave a single nod and had, Eliza noticed, the decency to look as though it cost her something. No triumph lived in that face, only the careful expression of a woman who had done what she considered necessary and took no pleasure in the necessity. I am sorry, Lady Constance said, for what it is worth. It's worth something, Eliza replied. She meant it. She had not intended to say goodbye. A letter had seemed cleaner. Cleaner for him, cleaner for her, because she knew herself well enough to understand that speaking it to his face would mean speaking it badly, and speaking it badly would be worse than silence. But she went to the library. She told herself it was for the Gilbert White left on the table. She told herself it would take 3 minutes. She told herself a great many things in that corridor. None of them were entirely honest. She had been sitting in the library for 20 minutes. The book before her, a sheet of paper, a pen, not a single word written, when she heard him. Mrs. Garrett tells me you've requested a reference letter, Dorian said from the doorway. She set the pen down. Henry is nearly weaned. It was always going to be time, eventually. Eventually is not this week. Why does it need to be this week? He stepped into the room. She made herself hold still, made herself not retreat, which was what her body demanded, and also not move toward him, which was what some other, far less sensible part of her wanted. Is this Constance? Not a question. A thing he already knew. It's sense, she said, and her voice held steadier than she deserved. Whatever you may prefer to believe, it is only sense, and you know it. I cannot remain here and I cannot stay and be what I am to Henry when the world will twist that into something that wounds him, either by making it into what it isn't or by making it into what it is. Either way, he pays for it. Either way, you pay for it. She stopped, started again, quieter. And I am not. I cannot. Her gaze found the window, the lamp, anywhere but his face. I am not someone who can afford the mistake of remaining where I do not belong. I have already made that mistake once. I know how it ends, and if I asked you to stay, she forced herself to look at him, forced herself to hold it. As what, Dorian? As what would you ask me to stay? He was quiet a long time. Long enough that the silence shifted, became not hesitation, but the precise sound of a man meeting an honest question with his honest answer, and finding that answer insufficient. She watched him reach for something true and good and enough. She watched him fail, and she loved him for the reaching, and it made nothing easier. I thought so, she said softly. She picked up the pen, wrote the letter, brief, professional, the letter of a woman who is certain of what she is doing. She placed it on his desk. She took the Gilbert White. She walked out of the library. She did not look back. Had she looked, she would have seen him standing perfectly still in the center of the room, holding the letter she had written, reading it with the face of a man who has just been shown precisely what his silence cost. She did not look back. Some mercies you must grant yourself. She was gone 11 days. He counted every one. The house remained the same. That was the maddening thing. The house was entirely, stubbornly, insultingly unchanged. The same corridors, the same rooms, the same library with the same chair beside the window, a chair he could not glance at without feeling something he had no word for. The same east corridor at 5 in the morning, which was simply a corridor now. Empty in a way corridors are not meant to be empty, because corridors do not usually hold presences, not ones you notice, not ones you miss. He noticed. He missed. He said none of it aloud. He was the Duke of Windermere, and no protocol existed for what moved through him. He had spent his entire adult life reshaping his inner terrain to match the outer one. It was failing. Henry did not understand where she had gone. Too young to grasp it, old enough to feel the wrongness, a missing note in the only music he had ever known. He grew fretful, then quiet, then fretful again. The unspecific distress of someone who senses a fracture but cannot name it. On the third day, he said her name. Just once. Into the still nursery at the 5 o'clock hour, the dark corridor hour, the moment she had always appeared, as though announcing himself to someone who ought to have been standing there. No one answered. Dorian stood in the doorway and heard his son call for a woman who was gone, and something passed through him that had no word in any language he possessed. Only the flat, surgical knowledge that he was the reason she was absent, that his silence, when she had asked him the one question that mattered, had been its own reply. On the 5th day, Lord Pearl looked at him across the breakfast table and spoke without preamble. Quote 99, quote 100, quote 101, quote 102. Pearl set his fork down. Quote 103, quote 104, quote, Dorian said. His voice was even. He was profoundly tired of it being even. Quote 105. Quote, Pearl went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the lightness had left his voice entirely. Quote 106, he said. Quote 107. Dorian looked at his brother. Quote 108, he said. Quote 109, Pearl leaned forward. Quote 110. A long silence settled between them. Quote 111, Dorian said quietly. Quote 112. Quote 113, Pearl said simply. Quote 114. Dorian looked at his brother for a long time. He thought of the letter she had left on his desk, brief, professional, the handwriting of a woman who had decided. He had read it 6 times. Each reading sharpened the outline of what he had failed to say, and what that failure had cost her. A woman already failed once by someone's silence, someone's absence, someone's careful refusal to commit. Failed again by his. He thought of Henry speaking her name into the empty nursery. He thought of the bookmark, the ribbon on the desk, the quiet, complete way she had settled into a chair, read for an hour, and asked nothing of him. The way she had said his name, Dorian, for the first time in the lamplight, rain pressing against the glass. He stood up. He called for his horse. She was in her father's garden when he arrived. It was a small garden, nothing like Windmere, nothing like the old section with its climbing roses and that wall that seemed to have opinions of its own. But it belonged to her father, and it was familiar. It carried that particular green scent of Somerset in spring. She had been standing in it for 20 minutes, accomplishing nothing beyond the deliberate labor of not thinking. 11 days in her father's house, helping where she could, sleeping long, heavy hours, slowly with enormous effort. She had been building the case inside herself that she had done the right thing, the sensible thing, the thing that shielded Henry and Dorian and whatever small, fragile existence she might still assemble from what remained. She had not finished building it. She was still at work. She thought perhaps, given enough time, it might hold. She was in the garden when she heard the horse. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. That registered before she had fully recognized it was him. Road dust, hair in disorder. The specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 11 days arguing with himself and has finally, at great personal cost, lost. He dismounted before the horse had come to a full stop. He walked toward her with the gait of someone who has reached a decision and will not permit himself the interval to reverse it. "Your Grace," she began. "Don't," he said. He stopped before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back. A brief, absurd thought crossed her mind. How tall he was, how she had never quite adjusted to it, the way his scale rearranged every space he occupied. "I let you walk out of that library because I was afraid," he said. His voice was level. It had cost him to keep it level. She could hear the price. Not of what the world would say. I have handled the world's opinions before, I will handle them again. I was afraid of what I was asking you to bear. He paused, not losing his nerve, gathering it. A child who is not yours by blood, though he has chosen you as completely as one person can choose another. A household steeped in someone else's history. A man who is still, his jaw tightened for a moment, who is not entirely reassembled, who does not yet know all the ways he might fail, and who is terrified of failing you in particular. Something deep in her chest went very still, very warm. "And then I was afraid you would say no," he continued. "And then you were gone. And Henry called your name into the darkness at 5 in the morning, and I understood that some fears simply do not matter. That only one fear matters, and it is this. A life where I chose my own cowardice over you. You are a duke," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she had stopped attempting to make it so. "Yes, I have no name worth mentioning, no family to... I am the woman who..." "I know what you are," he said quietly. "I know what was done to you. I know that someone stood before you once and made promises and left. And I know the last thing you require from me is promises that sound like his. So I will not promise you things that exist only in the future." He reached out and took her hands, both of them. With the same careful, deliberate grip she had watched him use the first time he held his son, as though he understood precisely what he was holding. "I am going to tell you what is true right now, today, in this garden," he said. "I have been awake at 5 every morning for 11 days, walking a corridor that is only a corridor. I sat in the library last night and felt your absence in that chair more completely than I have felt most presences. My son says your name, and when he says it, I understand he is not confused. He knows exactly who you are to him. He paused. And so do I. She looked at him for a long time. She had sworn to herself after the last time that she would not be moved by words, that she would demand evidence, that she would not allow the architecture of a sentence, however finely built, to persuade her of something only time and action could prove. She had made that vow, and she had meant to honor it, and she still meant to honor it. But he had ridden through the night. That was not a sentence. That was not a promise. That was a man who had measured the distance against the alternative and chosen the distance. You understand this will be difficult, she said. Her voice measured, precise. The voice of a woman who loves someone and is still learning not to shield herself from it. There will be people who will not, that Henry will have to. I know, he said. I have considered every version, and the one where I let you go is the only one I cannot survive. Henry will require an enormous amount of explaining, she said at last. When he is old enough to make sense of any of it. Dorian's mouth curved. Quote, _138 __. So none. He laughed. That open, ungoverned laugh she had carried in her chest like a warm stone for 11 days. She had taken it out each evening, studied it, and placed it carefully back. She stepped forward. He met her halfway. She would say later that the kiss was nothing like what she expected. Not the dramatic, consuming thing from novels she had never quite believed in. Not a declaration, simply honest. Two people who had weathered the worst of each other. The grief and the silence and the carefully performed adequacy. Choosing yes, choosing it plainly, without spectacle, without conditions. Her hands found the front of his coat. His arms came around her, careful, then certain, the way he did most things. Slowly, deliberately, and then completely. Simple and absolute and entirely hers. Henry Ashford took his first steps on a Tuesday morning in the nursery at Windermere Manor. Between his father's outstretched hands and his mother's voice, he had been threatening to walk for a fortnight, pulling himself upright on every available surface, standing with the fierce, furrowed concentration of someone solving a very difficult problem, then sitting back down with an expression that suggested the problem required further thought. The household had held its breath. Even Mrs. Garrett had been observed lingering near the nursery door at intervals. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday with no ceremony. Dorian knelt at one end of the nursery, hands outstretched. Eliza sat at the other end, Henry standing against her leg. She said his name the way she always said it, warm, certain, without condition. Henry looked at her, looked at his father, made the calculation, 4 steps, unsteady, gloriously effortful, each one an act of faith. Then he sat down with great deliberateness, regarded them both, and said what sounded very much like, quote, 139. Dorian laughed until his eyes were bright. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth, shoulders shaking. His son watched him with profound satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who has produced the desired effect. Eliza, the Duchess of Windermere, in a marriage that had scandalized exactly the number of people her husband predicted and delighted exactly the number Lord Pearl had predicted, which was most of them, sat on the nursery floor in a morning gown that cost more than she once earned in a year. She held out her arms. Henry crawled back to her, gripped her sleeve to stand, assessed the distance to his father with the air of a person reconsidering a challenge, and tried again. There is a kind of grief no one prepares you for, but there is also a kind of love like that, the kind that does not announce itself, that does not arrive in a grand gesture or a turning point you can circle on a calendar, that comes instead through small doors, a corridor at 5 in the morning, a bookmark left without comment on a desk, a child who learns your name before any other, the kind built over weeks and months from shared silences and honest conversations, and the radical, quietly revolutionary act of being known, the kind that chooses you before you have chosen it, before you are ready, before you have convinced yourself you deserve it. And when it finds you, even in the ruins, even in the grief, even in the body that has been broken, and the heart that has been left, and the life that was taken before it could begin, you will know it by this. It will not ask you to be all right. It will not require you to perform or explain yourself. or become smaller so it can be more comfortable. It will simply stay. And that, in the end, is everything. If this story lingered, if Eliza's grief pressed against your ribs, if the moment Henry spoke her name stopped your breath, if Dorian's midnight ride finally let something in you unclench, tell me. Drop it in the comments. Which moment held you? I read every one. I mean that completely. And if you arrived here for the first time and stayed until this final breath, welcome. This is what lives here. Stories of people broken in ways no one mourns aloud, finding their way to each other. Subscribe so the next one finds you. And if someone in your life needs a love story right now, send this their way. Sometimes that single gesture is enough. Thank you for listening. Look after yourselves and each other. I'll see you in the next one.